Awesome. We are now live on our various social media channels. So thank you for taking time to join us. My name is Andrew Wool. I'm the managing partner here at CPA for IT, where our mission is to help our clients organize their finances, create wealth, and transform wealth into a legacy. Today's session is From Business Income to Long-Term Wealth, a practical investment roadmap for Canadian small business owners. So we're hoping that this will be a fun and informative session. It is not a session on what stocks to buy by any stretch of the imagination, but hopefully will be a general good guideline session for small business owners on investment strategies. So got the slideshow up now, which is awesome. If I can just get everything to just need this perfect. So again, as I said, this is not a stock picking webinar. It's more of a practical framework for turning business success into personal financial security. Because business owners do face different challenges than traditional employees. So you got to have money set aside for income tax. You've got cash flow issues. You've got risk and retirement issues that are very different from a typical employee and are all sort of connected. So this session is really going to be educational session designed specifically for small business owners and how they can address their individual tax and investment decisions. Of course, all of this does require you to have a conversation with your financial advisor and your accountant. So big giant caveat here, this is not intended to replace any financial advice, and I am not a financial advisor. But it is important that we start with understanding the fundamental differences between small business owners versus employees, and that with the corporation now you're focused on revenue and profit and wealth. So, revenue being your top line, profit being your bottom line after expenses, and wealth, when we look at that, we're looking at the retained earnings. Because when we talk about helping our clients organize their finances to create wealth and transform wealth into a legacy, we often see the corporation as one of the biggest tools for building that wealth and creating that legacy. And the long-term goal for our clients is to build up enough investments inside your corporation that you could live off of the annuity or the return on those investments so that you never need to touch the principal, and the principal becomes an estate that you're passing on to your children or an important cause. Now, quick question for everyone in the audience, and it's somewhat rhetorical, is how many of you actually know what last year's revenue was and what last year's profit was for your businesses? Not enough of my clients actually can give me that information right off the top, and even fewer understand the difference between the profit that they had in that individual year and the wealth that they're creating. Because a company can show strong revenue, but have lots of expenses and have little to no liquidity, and be building up no retained earnings inside your corporation. So top line revenue is by no means the measure of success when it comes to creating wealth and transforming wealth into a legacy. And unfortunately, even setting money aside and saving isn't the key to wealth either, because not only do you have to set the money aside, but you've got to invest it and get it generating a return. And hopefully in a way that is mitigating risks. And there are some pretty big risks that are hiding in plain sight that are important to talk about. So maybe we'll jump over to some of the big ones. And that is, within your investment portfolio, most people understand the risk of having a lack of diversification and putting all your investments into one stock. Very few people would do that. But the reality is, when it comes to small business owners, they are doing that by putting the majority of their net worth either in their principal residence or just in their corporation as well, without having that adequately invested and diversified. Now, the one thing is, anyone who's been with us for a while knows we had an accountant who worked with us for years named Bob Novoselak, who went off to become an investment advisor, and has his own process. And he always taught me that diversification can be a bit of a misnomer. And diversification is a good thing, but it can also be a bad thing. You can diversify away your returns and your profit. And that having some diversification to having a mix of portfolios, a well-balanced portfolio that is going to include physical real estate, stocks, bonds, GICs, is a good strategy, but we don't want to over diversify and eliminate all of the risk. Yes, eliminating the risk is great, but if we eliminate all the risk at the expense of all the profit, we have eliminated the best returns that we can generate for the business. So one of the things we'll talk about a little bit more in detail is understanding, what is your risk appetite, and how does that affect your investment strategy. But I would say regardless of whether you are high risk or low risk individual based on a multitude of factors, every individual should be focused on this sort of simple 5-part wealth building system that we've put together, which is first step is you've got to earn it. So you've got to be able to go out, get the contracts, put the money in the bank, and have the top line profit. Second, we need to create profit. And we need to make sure that while we have good top line revenue, we actually are not spending every dollar that we earn. We need to make sure that we have cash flow to be able to pay our upcoming bills and our taxes. Next is protecting it. We've got to keep the plan alive for when something goes wrong. So that means having things like insurance products where applicable, whether that be life insurance, death, disability, limited liability protection through the corporation structures. There's a number of tools that we can use to help protect the funds that we're investing, but we have to think of this as part of the step in our processes. First, we earn it, then we protect it, next we invest it. And investing it is a really critical part, because if you're not investing it, and you're leaving money sitting in cash or GICs, odds are you're losing time value of money, because inflation is growing faster than your rate of return, which means you're actually losing money on that money that's sitting in physical gold or sitting in cash or sitting in your bank account. So you need to actually invest it and generate a return. There's a number of vehicles that you can do that in. You can invest in physical real estate. You can invest in stocks and bonds and GICs. In other corporations. The world is your oyster, but obviously investing the money is absolutely critical, as is obviously optimizing the return on those investments and looking at that on a regular basis with a financial advisor or coach who knows and understands your own risk tolerance, your own appetite for growth, so that you can structure a strategy that generates the greatest return while managing risk at a level that suits your individual needs. And then lastly, it's transferring this. How are we going to get the money out of the corporation? Are we looking at taking money out in the form of salary, in the form of dividends? Are we looking at setting up insurance policies so that the money can come out through a capital dividend account down the road? This is all part of the 5-part wealth building system. And each of these steps are processes that you should be thinking through. And you might be at various stages of this game. Some of you may not have even started your first contract and aren't earning your income yet. Some of you might be earning your income and starting to put it into your corporation, but haven't thought about protecting it. Others have thought about protecting it and in fact are even beginning to invest it, but haven't begun to optimize that investment strategy. And then even fewer have thought long-term, okay, how much money do I need for myself? How much money is going to go to my children or to my estate? And how am I going to do that in the most tax-efficient process possible? So that is the high-level strategy, but that starts with tactical day-to-day operations, which is where we want to give every dollar that we work with a job or a responsibility. So first of all, we want to look at operating income or working capital. That's things like having money set aside to pay your taxes, to pay your property tax, to pay your mortgage, to pay your insurance, to pay your automobile expenses, to pay your telephone and bills that we're going to have every single month. So we need to make sure that we have money set aside for our day-to-day operating expenses. Next, we want to have a reserve. So money set aside for your personal income taxes, your corporate income taxes, your GST, as well as some savings, right? And the general rule of thumb that we use for a lot of our clients is at the bare minimum, you need to be setting aside 30 cents on every dollar just to account for the taxes that you're going to have to deal with at the end of the year. And when it comes to self-employed individuals, this is one of the greatest risks that you have is if you were historically an employee and you're used to the government taking money off your paycheck, you spend every dollar that you earn. And far too many consultants who start working through a corporation spend just like they were an employee, and they're not taking that 30% and setting it aside. And it is really important to make sure that you're setting aside a reserve for at the bare minimum your personal taxes, your corporate taxes, and your GST, HST. Now, of course, in an ideal world, we're doing that as well as setting aside money for our savings and for our future. Of course, we also want to have a separate set of funds set aside as an emergency reserve for, like, let's say the roof goes and we've got to replace the roof. We've got to have access to funds available to do that. One of my favorite tools for having that sort of safety net is a TFSA. We're going to talk about the different vehicles a little bit later on in the session as well. But the tax-free savings account, as many of you know, is great because all of the return and growth that you have in the tax-free savings account is tax-free, which is where it gets its name. But almost more importantly is the fact that if you needed to draw from your tax-free savings account to do something like a roof or some other type of emergency, if you wait a full calendar year, you will actually get that room back. Whereas if you pulled from your RSP, you're going to have to pay tax on that income when you pull it out. With the TFSA, you're not going to have to pay tax on it because it's already been taxed. With an RSP, you'd have to pay tax when you pull it out. Plus, in the RSP, you don't get that room back. Once you've pulled it out, and there's only two exceptions to that, which is the lifelong learning plan and the home buyer's plan, which are specific for going back to school or buying your first house. Outside of that, if you pull money out of your RSPs, it's going to be taxed and you're not getting that room back. Whereas the TFSA is a great sort of emergency reserve fund. Next is we want to have money set aside for investing and growth to generate some returns for retirement. And that can be in a combination of inside your corporation as well as outside your corporation in either registered investments like TFSAs, RSPs. And again, as I said, we'll talk a little bit more about the different vehicles in a second, as well as potentially unregistered investments. And how that product mix will be dependent on your individual situation, right? If you've got a bunch of inheritance that you've received personally and it's already been taxed, you're likely to have unregistered investments. But if you've been an independent contractor your whole life and that was your only source of income, then you're likely to have a much larger mix inside your corporation and a much smaller mix in your RRSPs and in unregistered investments. That doesn't make it wrong. It's figuring out the right mix for yourself. Next, we do also encourage having another extra reserve fund set aside for opportunities. So this could be growth, whether that be growth through acquisitions, growth through purchase of new equipment, new resources. If you want to have the ability to be able to grow your business, often that requires cash flow to be able to do that. And setting aside a small stipend of 5 to 10% so that you have those funds available for growth can set you up for the best possible success that you could have. Now, as we said earlier, the amount of reserve that you should have in these combination of funds is going to be dependent on your individual situation, and there's not a generic answer number that I can give you. We do often tell people set aside 30% as the bare minimum But like I said, that is generic and is a quick and dirty answer that doesn't really help you with your individual situation. And the right amount depends on how quickly your revenue could drop, like how quickly you could lose your job, how quickly your expenses could rise, how dependent you or your business is on any one individual client. You know, if you've got one large client and you're not sure that the contract could be renewed, and your skill set is very unique, and it might take a longer period of time to find that next contract, you should have a larger reserve than someone who has a skill set that is more generic, and they have multiple clients and their risk is lower. And you know, on the flip side of that, if we look at the difference between the different types of clients that we have, IT consultants, realtors, and doctors, we can see that with an IT consultant, you know, there's risk with being, you know, only on one client and potentially losing that client and losing that source of income. Whereas the real estate agents have a very different risk cycle because there's much larger gaps between their commissions versus an IT consultant who's billing every 2 weeks. So they need to have more reserve to be able to handle those cash flow crises because it might be 6, 12, 18 months before the next property is sold. So, you know, IT consultants versus real estates are going to have different risk tolerances, a different volatility, and therefore need to set aside different amounts of reserves. And then again, if you look at medical doctors who have, you know, predictable revenue like the IT consultants, and don't have that volatility in cash flow the way realtors do, but they do have much higher office and staffing commitments, and again need to make sure that they have cash flow adequate to cover those. So you can imagine that with those three different scenarios in and of themselves, just looking at the big macro pictures, they'd have very different situations. And what the most important thing to do is to figure out, well, where do you fit on that curve? How are you spending money today? What changes could you make to your process so that you could set more aside for these emergency reserves? Now, setting aside in the money and investing it, as we said, is only one part of the process. Because if you've got that money sitting in a GIC, or even worse, just in cash in your bank account, it might feel safe to you because you have limited risk and volatility. You know, you're not exposed to the stock market. What you may or may not realize is that you have a greater risk, and that's that you are actually losing money based on the rate of inflation and the return you're getting on your bank. If you're getting a 0.5% rate of return, but inflation is 2 to 3%, you're losing 2.5 to 3% on every dollar that you've got sitting in cash. Now, GIC might be slightly better. Maybe you're getting 2, maybe you're even getting closer to 3%. But then you've got to look at, well, what's my risk as far as concentration risk? What's my risk as far as opportunity cost? Have I missed out on potential opportunities? If I just put this in an S&P 500 index fund, you know, would I have made 5, 10, you know, percent versus the 2 to 3% I've made, which is basically break even for me. And of course, there's other risks that you've got as well. You could have liability from vendors. You could have liability from the CRA. You could have behavior risk. You could have cyber risk. There's a lot of things that go along with even just keeping cash aside. And whether that's cash in a physical bank account or cash in the form of gold bars under your bed, you're facing these same issues if you're just putting the money in cash and not looking to invest it. Now, when it comes to investing, there are a couple key points that I think are critical to look out for, that are more important than sort of finding the next big thing or the next stock, because everyone's always looking for, like, hey, what's the stock I buy? What's the product I buy? What's the thing that's going to generate a 10, 15, 20% rate of return? And I think Bob's advice to me was always that you make money when you buy your stocks. And there are a number of things that you need to look at when you are making your purchases. So when you're looking at the timeline, um, you want to look at how liquid do you need these funds? Do I need money at the end of the year to pay my GST and my HST and my payroll? Or is this a longer term investment that I'm looking for to save for my retirement or to save for my estate? And that timeline will dictate, to a large extent, the amount of products that you have available to you, and then as a result of that, the type of returns that you might be able to generate and the risk profile that is available to you. Because if you need liquidity and you need access to those funds, you are more limited in the tools that are available to you. Yeah, you can put it in stocks, you can put it in bonds, you can put it in GICs. But even in GICs, now you've got to look at shorter terms, and as well as with stocks and bonds, you might be forced into selling at a time that is less than ideal, and maybe that's not the right fit for you. So understanding that liquidity is critical. And then, of course, understanding how much risk that you're willing to bear with that, which again is going to probably be likely tied to, well, what is this money for? Is this for my retirement? And if it's for my retirement, how old am I? If I'm younger, I can afford to take much greater risks. If I'm older and I've built up a significant net worth, my strategy now is not about growth. It's about protection and making sure that I don't erode all this equity that I've built over the years. So it's important to make sure that you understand, the purpose of these funds, which is why we break those into those different categories, and then having different risk allocation for the different types of funds that you're investing. Right? If you need money set aside again for taxes at the end of the year, that's not something you're going to be putting into a high risk, high return investment, right? That's something you want in a slow and steady investment, that good blue chip stock, like a Canadian bank that's going to give you 4% plus potential upside, right? So you're going to make that 4%, so you're going to be beating inflation just on the dividend, and then you've got the hope for upside as well. And if you maybe lose a little bit or gain a little bit, it's not going to make or break the bank. Lastly, again, looking at diversification and making sure that you are diversified in that you have a balanced portfolio, so that if the real estate market gets crushed, you have some options and some other assets in your portfolio mix that are going to balance things out. But not so much so that if you have a portfolio that's so diversified that when one thing goes up, another thing goes down, and you end up making no money because they're just hedging against each other, then you've not done the job of what you're going to do. But when it comes to figuring out these 4 questions, again, it's going to be matching the investment job or the type of money that you're using to the right vehicle, right? And so we've got a small guideline here to help you figure out, what your priorities should be based on the timeline of when you need money. So if you need money for those tax reserves or near-term purchases like purchasing a car or a home in the next year, the goal here is protecting the capital, not growth and market. Now you start looking at shorter term duration, maybe at 3 to 5 years, like, hey, I want to buy a home, but I'm not ready yet. We're a couple of years out. Now you can start to balance stability and growth. It's not so much about protecting the assets. It's I want to protect the assets, yes, but I want to make sure that I'm getting growth and return as well. So I'm probably not going to be happy with a 3 or 4% rate of return on a 3 to 5 year plan. As we go further and further out, it becomes more and more that we have tools that we know are going to generate a profit, and that are more diversified and that are going to generate that retirement bridge that we're looking for. And then as we go even further out, where we're looking at prioritizing long-term growth, we're looking at other tools like investment vehicles and tools that will have tax advantages that can help us to mitigate some of the downsides of investing, which is that unfortunately, inside of a corporation, that investment income is going to be subject to a higher tax rate than your consulting income. Now, we've talked about sort of figuring out what the right product mix is, but figuring out what is the right tool is literally a topic that we have an entire webinar dedicated to. And I'm not going to go into the weeds too much today, other than to have a quick high-level discussion of the different types of vehicles that are out there. If you want to dive deeper into any of these, I do encourage you to go look at our past webinar where we go through in about an hour-long detail the different vehicles and where you should be using them. As I said earlier, the TFSA is a great emergency reserve spot. The downside when you're a small business owner is in order to fund your TFSA, you're going to have to pull funds out of your corporation and you're going to have to pay personal tax on that income in order to get it into your corporation where it can then continue to grow tax-free. I do think it's important that everybody have, at least $10,000 to $20,000 in their TFSA to have as that emergency reserve, because it can be invested, generating a return for you. And if, God forbid, the roof of your house blows off, you've got access to funds that, when you build up when you save the money back up, you can put it back into your TFSA. Now, the RSP doesn't have that same flexibility where you can pull the money out, but it is still very effective as a tax deferral strategy. So, a good RSP strategy is going to be leveraging the RSPs to get money out of your corporation into your RSPs at a tax deferred strategy, because you don't pay tax on the RSP until you pull it out. But not only a tax deferred strategy, a tax optimized strategy by looking at what investment vehicles you're putting into the RSP versus inside the corporation. Because if you're investing inside the corporation, it's going to be taxed at a higher rate, as I said in the last slide. But on capital gains, you're only going to pay tax on half of it. And on dividends, yes, you pay a refundable tax on that, but as I said, it's refundable and you'll get that tax back if and when you do issue dividends down the road. Now, insurance, unfortunately, with the insurance, you're going to, interest, you're going to pay tax on that. But we can certainly have expenses that we apply against some of the investment income, like brokerage fees and those types of things. But depending upon the type of investment that you've got, if you invested inside your RSP, you could be potentially paying half as much tax. Because if the investment is in a capital gain, it is largely capital gains based. It's a growth-based investment and you're looking to generate capital gains. Inside the corporation, yeah, you're going to pay at the general rate, but you're only going to pay in the general rate on half of it. Whereas inside your RSP, it's tax deferred and you're not paying any money today, but when you take the money out, you're going to pay tax at whatever your marginal tax rate is, which is, for most of you, going to be higher than the general rate inside the corporation, first of all. And second of all, you're not getting that capital gains exemption, right? So that means that you're paying tax on, if you earned $10 in capital gains inside the corporation, you'd pay tax on $5. If it was in your RSP, you're going to be paying tax on 10, on the full amount. So that's an important thing in understanding the nuances between these different companies or these different vehicles. So RSP, good tax deferral strategy, because you're not going to have to pay tax to get it out of your corporation because it comes out in income. You get a RSP tax credit that offsets that income. You pay no tax in the corporation, no tax personally, until you pull the funds out of your RSP. And then when you pull them out, you're going to pay tax on every dollar that you've earned, not just on the type of investment it is. So investing inside your corporation, one, you are arguably looking at a lower tax rate of your marginal rate versus the general rate inside the corporation. And the marginal rate can go up as high as 53.54%, whereas inside the corporation, it only goes up to a maximum of 38%. And even within that, there's abatements that bring it closer to 28%. But figuring out the right vehicle and then once you're building money inside of your corporation and you build up enough net worth, there becomes the benefit of setting up a holding company down the road, which brings in a whole nother case around holding companies. And again, we've got a whole nother session, an hour-long session dedicated to holding companies where we talk about the advantages of holding companies. But the long and short of it is if you're building up money inside of your corporation and it started to generate $10,000, $20,000 based on returns on an annual basis, then a holding company is going to start to make economic sense because it can save you more money in taxes than it would cost you to run and operate. But if you're earning less than $10,000 to $20,000 in investment income on an annualized basis, you're probably fine with just one operating company. Again, what I would say is, general caveat here, talk to an accountant about your individual situation to figure out what is the right strategy for you. Now, one of the things that this does sort of tie into is the erosion of the small business deduction. So as self-employed individuals, if you are starting to invest inside of your corporation, which we encourage, and we're advocating that the corporation is the tool to generating generational wealth, then why are we doing that if it could potentially erode our small business deduction? And first, it's important to know and understand that the erosion of the small business deduction is based on the net investment income, which is again why holding companies can help us with this issue, as well as the general tax issue, is because we can move more expenses. When we have an operating company and a holding company, we have more control over what expenses go into what company, including your own salary. So we can make sure that the holding company, which has the investments, has little or no profit by taking some control over some of the expenses that we've got some discretionary control, think like home office, telephone and internet, which might be used for both businesses. And you can take a little bit more discretionary control over that, your own salary and remuneration. And the reason that this is important is because for every dollar over $50,000 of net investment income, it's going to begin to erode your small business deduction rate. And for those of you not familiar, on the first $500,000 of small business income, you pay only 12.2%. On anything above that, you're going to be at the general rate of 38%, minus your abatements. So that's a significant difference. And so the strategy is first and foremost to reduce the net income in the holding company so that it's below $50,000 and doesn't erode your small business deduction, number one. And number two, by moving more expenses into your holding company and having less net income in the holding company, you're paying less tax at the general rate of 28 or 38%, and more tax in your operating company because your salary and your home office and whatever expenses have been moved over are not in there anymore. So you're paying more tax on that income, but that income is only at 12.2% here in Ontario, so you pay a much better rate of return. So it's important to know and understand that there are some limitations with investing within the corporation, and to understand how there are tools and vehicles that we can use to our benefit when it comes to controlling how we're taxed on that investment income, and how it affects our active business income within our small business as well. So now getting to that sort of last stage of getting access to those funds. So let's say that we've invested the money, it's generated income, the corporation has paid tax, we've tracked our refundable dividends on RDTOH and ERDTOH, we've tracked our capital dividends on our capital gains. And now we need to figure out how we're going to get that money out. Is it coming out in the form of taxable dividends? Is it coming out in the form of non-taxable dividends with a CDA? Is it coming out in the form of traditional salary? And what are the options for us? And again, a lot of that is going to depend on your individual investment portfolio mix. Because if you've got a lot of stocks that have dividends, you're going to be building up recoverable dividend tax on hand, whether that be eligible recoverable dividend or non-eligible recoverable dividends. But these are the taxes that you pay on your dividends that are recoverable to you if and when you issue a dividend down the road. Now, generally speaking, when we're talking about the discussion of salary versus dividend, our firm's approach is, well, you're in your income earning years, you want to take the money out of your corporation in the form of a salary. And we recommend that because, one, you have income to apply that salary against. It's not going to generate a loss that will fall off the table. Two, you're going to build up some RRSP room, which, as we mentioned, we do think is a good tool for the right products. Three, you're going to build up an CPP contribution room, which is not necessarily the best investment you're going to have in your portfolio mix, but it is a guaranteed return on investment. So you know that, well, you may not be able to retire here in Canada. At the bare minimum, you could take your CPP and OAS and go live in a developing country and still have a retirement, even if it couldn't be in Canada based on what you're generating off CPP and OAS. So those are good tools that we do value. Now, there are certain situations where we might recommend a dividend over a salary during your income earning years. And that might be if, one, we have losses in your corporation. So let's imagine that your corporation is earning income, but you've got significant operating costs that year to the point of when we factor in your salary, we're going to generate a loss in your corporation. And a loss in a corporation can be applied backwards up to 3 years and generate a corporate tax refund. If you don't have any profits in the last 3 years, you can't get a refund, but that loss doesn't necessarily fall off the table. What it will happen is it will carry forward and be able to be applied against future income that you have in your corporation. The problem arises is that if you are consistently overspending and you're going to have a loss every single year, you might be better off not taking a loss that continues to build up and build up and build up. What we'll then do is instead consider taking your remuneration in the form of a salary, in the form of a dividend, which comes out of retained earnings as opposed to out of the net income. So your salary is its revenue minus expenses, and the salary is an expense. And that becomes your net income before tax. You pay tax. After that, it becomes retained earnings. The retained earnings are what we use to pay dividends. So you've paid corporate tax already on any funds that you wish to issue as a dividend. Because you've paid some corporate taxes already on that, the corporation or the government acknowledges that and gives you a dividend tax credit intended to equalize that. And there's something called the theory of equalization, which is intended to make there no tax difference between salary and dividend. And when I say no tax difference, it doesn't mean that the amount you pay in personal tax will be the same. What I mean by no tax difference is when you add up the taxes you paid for corporate taxes and personal taxes on the dividend, that should be the same as if you were to take the money as a salary and you would only pay personal taxes. And what I can tell you is we've done enough number crunching over the years to know that it is within a few dollars. And so that is, like I said, the benefits come out of RSP, CPP, and looking at your corporation as far as its income. And then, of course, once you stop working and you're into retirement, you built up all this money inside your corporation. Well, how are we getting it out? Well, we're going to switch over to a dividend in those first couple of years. We probably have large tax refunds that we're going to get back for the corporation because all the tax that we paid on those dividends while we were earning them is going to be refundable because now in retirement, we're living off the annuity and we're pulling money out, hopefully very tax effectively as a dividend and hopefully below the CPP and the OAS clawback amounts. So we're still getting full CPP and OAS at the most tax efficient way possible. Now, assuming that you've done all of this correctly, the last step is just protecting the plan from risks that you can't afford to self-insure. So, market volatility, business interruption, critical illness, liability, death, and succession. And for those, the best tools we say are insurance products. And for anyone who has heard me speak before, you know I am a huge fan of insurance products because they demonstrate a risk per profit or loss, which is a critical factor when it comes to the IT consultants for personal service business risk. And to circle back with what we said earlier is, IT consultants, realtors, and doctors are very different in their priorities. The overall framework remains the same. So we know that, the risk tolerance is going to be different. The investment portfolio mix is going to be different, but this same methodology can apply no matter where you are, as whether that be an IT consultant, a real estate professional, or a doctor, and no matter where you are in the life scale of your business, whether you're just starting out or you're more senior, this process works for all stages. It's just figuring out what your risk tolerance is and what your product mix will be within your individual portfolios. So we did want to close with sort of a practical 12-month roadmap for you so that you can get started on your investment strategy if you're not already doing it. So in the first quarter, we want to look at measuring and figuring out where you are now, right? So that's the first step, is understanding where you are. How much money do you have in your investments inside your corporation, outside your corporation? What is your property worth? For many of our clients, we call this our pyramid of power, which is where you are now. Next, we want to focus on stabilizing. We want to fund those reserve accounts that we talk about, make sure if we haven't been putting enough aside that we're putting money aside for those future obligations as well as for investing. We want to set up things like automatic transfers, so that after each paycheck, money is automatically being broken out into these various sub accounts. And I'm all for having multiple bank accounts. One can be set aside for taxes. One can be set aside for long-term investing. One can be set aside for emergency reserve. And those can be just bank accounts. Those can be, investment accounts with Waterhouse or Investor's Edge or whatever you have. And then once those monies are set aside, obviously we want to actually go through the process of actually investing. And whether that's doing it yourself, investing in things like index funds, or working with a financial planner, no matter what you do, you need to be doing something to get your money working for you. And if you don't have an investment advisor and are looking for one, we're happy to make a recommendation. Many of you know we work with IT360 and Bob Novoselak. As well, if you're still not ready to hire a financial planner, my number one recommendation is a book by Tony Robbins called Money Mastering the Game, in which he basically says, follow Ray Dalio and just put your money in index funds and you're going to outperform most financial advisors anyways. But of course, once you're investing, that is not the end of the process. We need to make sure that you are coming back and reviewing everything. So reviewing your salary dividend mix, reviewing your passive income forecasts, your year-end transactions. And this is part of the process that we can be doing as your account managers to look with you every year. And in fact, should be something your account managers are doing to look at, okay, what's your cash situation like? You have too much in cash? Do you have not enough in stocks? Should you be investing? Should you be setting up a holding company? These are the types of things you should be going through with your account manager. And in fact, if you're not a client of ours, we've even developed 5 questions that you should be asking your financial advisor and your accountant. So these are core questions that every business needs to know, which is how much cash does my business truly need? And, things like how much money do I need to set aside for corporate tax, for GST, for payroll? How much do I need for the operating expenses of the business? What is my expected passive investment income over the next 3 years? How much money do you think you can generate from the existing product mix that you have? Are you satisfied with that? Should it be more aggressive, less aggressive? Which dollars belong in my TFSA versus my RSP versus my corporation? How should I take my remuneration? Should it be salary or dividends? And how does that support my retirement plan? And finally, what would happen financially if I lost my job and I needed to start covering all my operating costs with no income? And do I have money and funds set aside for that situation, or have I mitigated that risk with something like disability insurance or one of those vehicles? We've also come up with a couple of steps for you to follow over the next few months to get on the process, which is to make sure that you calculate what your current monthly budget is. So how much money are you actually spending and where's that money going? Separate the money that you need to have set aside for your taxes so that it's set aside separate from your investable cash. And I'm not saying it cannot be invested, but again, as we talked about earlier, money that's set aside for taxes should be in a more conservative, more liquid investment vehicle than money that you're setting aside for retirement. Set a target operating reserve. How much money do I want to set aside each year? Is 30% enough? Do I want it to be 40%? Do I want it to be 50%? What makes sense given my personal situation? Go through and list all the major risks that could impact you: losing your job, losing your client, being on a 1 month sabbatical, interest rates going up, whatever you can think of, and put those risks down and start putting together a strategy of how you're going to mitigate those risks if they were to come up. Do I use insurance products? Do I just set aside? Do I self-insure by setting emergency reserves aside? What's my strategy? Next, confirm your RSP and your TFSA room. See what room you have available and whether you should be using either of those vehicles now. Next, forecast your passive income for the upcoming years so that you can see, is this something I need to be worried about, the erosion of the small business deduction, and therefore I need to be considering a holding company this year versus next. Lastly, schedule at least one coordinated planning meeting with your accountant. And what I'm trying to encourage more and more clients to do is to book a meeting not only with their accountant for their year-end review, but a meeting with their accountant and their financial advisor to make sure that everyone is on the same page. And I apologize, I did tell everyone to put everything into Q&A, and I'm just seeing 2 questions that have come up now. So I'll try to get through those. What do you think of ETFs like HPP or HSAV that don't pay interest or dividends and try to be tax efficient? What do I think about ETFs in general? Generally speaking, I like ETFs because they are low cost vehicles that have diversification built into them. And some diversification built into them. Can be, depending on the vehicle, can be efficient. Now, what do I think about one that's focused more on growth than cash flow? Because that's what we're talking about, right? So you're banking on a higher capital gain, and you're not receiving interest or dividends or cash flow. And I tend to personally prefer high yield return. I like cash flow. And so I like things that are stable, safe, and conservative. To be honest, with Carney, running our government right now, coming from the former banking industry, I think it's hard pressed to beat Canadian bank stocks, even with an ETF. You're getting 4% typically in dividends, plus 5-10% or more in upside in capital gains. That's the type of mix I personally like. What you're saying is that they're optimizing from a tax, because with the capital gain, you're only going to pay tax on half of it. And now it does also depend on whether you're talking interest or dividends, because interest and dividends are taxed differently within your corporation. The dividend, it's just going to flow through. Yes, you pay a dividend tax, but it's a refundable dividend tax. So I'm not too worried about that. Whereas the interest can be troublesome because effectively you pay tax on the full amount. So from that perspective, and some clarification that looks like it's coming through, HPP versus HSAV are swap funds for corporate investing efficiency, not for growth. I'm going to be honest and say I'm not as familiar with these as like I'm not a financial advisor, so I'm not particularly familiar with those. But what I would say is, and this should be the overarching principle for everything. Don't let the tax tail wag the dog. It's an expression we use around here a lot. And I would be more concerned about whether the product is a fit for you based on when do you need liquidity, how does it fit as far as your risk tolerance, how does it fit as far as your product portfolio mix, rather than is it the most tax efficient. Now, if it fits all those and you're just trying to figure out what vehicle to put it in, then we want to start focusing on, the tax basis. But if you know, hey, look, this is definitely going to be a corporate investment because that's where the funds are, and now you're just trying to decide between that and another index fund or ETF, then I would say don't let the tax tail wag the dog. Look more closely at, okay, in my situation, I am going to be retiring in 2 years. Again, I'm going to want higher cash flow versus someone else who's going to be retiring in 15 to 20 years. They're going to be less concerned about cash flow and they won't need the interest or dividend income. So I know it's kind of a non-answer, but unfortunately that's probably the best I got for you. So let's see here. One's done. It's done, and we got one more here. Why do you recommend, or who do you recommend doing a total tax wealth estate plan, looking at all personal and corporate investments and succession planning? So the people we recommend for that right now would be IT360. They do a entire plan free of charge, no risk, no obligation for you to figure out whether you would choose to work with them. Now they are heavily indexed on mutual funds and insurance products, so may not be the fit for everybody, but they have great insurance products and they have a great tool for analyzing your current situation, looking at the whole picture. Of course, I always encourage everyone as well to work with their account manager here at CPA4IT, where at the bare minimum, we should be doing that pyramid of power to understand where you are now as far as your total net worth, and setting your goals for retirement as far as how much money you want to have on a regular ongoing basis, and then working backwards from there to figure out how much you should be setting aside each year. So we'll do some of that on a very basic level, but I'm assuming you're looking for a more in-depth wealth and estate plan based on a financial advisor. And so the people we'd recommend right now would be IT360. And happy to make a formal recommendation to Eric or someone on his team if that would be helpful. And I think with that, we pretty much have come to the end of the session. This was a new session for us, so I hope you guys found it helpful. I know it is somewhat generic, but what we're trying to focus in on is just a little bit more financial literacy. We still bring in, of course, people like Eric from IT360 to talk more specifics about individual investment tools. I am not a financial advisor. I cannot provide, investment advice. What I can do is share with you my own personal preferences, and share with you. But again, even questions like that swap tool, I'm not as familiar with those tools as someone who was a financial advisor might be. So take what I say with a grain of salt and recognize that it is coming from a biased perspective of an accountant rather than a financial advisor, and trying to get our clients on track for helping them to organize their finances, create wealth, and transform wealth into a legacy. And a critical component of being able to do that is investing. And investing inside your corporation, we believe, is the fastest path to generating generational wealth. So I'll leave it open for a few more minutes in case there are any other questions. Otherwise, thank you everyone for joining us. And we'll see you in 2 weeks at our next session. Thanks, everyone. Bye for now.